Um, didn't really sell quite enough books to make it on her own, but she certainly had a loyal following, led by Frank Thorne, I think, the artist who did it. And a lot of people went through there, good people like Wendy Peeney, who then went on to do ElfQuest, who wrote an issue, and my friend Claire Noto, who's a screenwriter that wrote some with me, and who's the other? Who did Sisterhood? Christy Marks, who wrote one, and so forth. We collaborated on one story, and she did such a good job, I couldn't figure out I needed to earn my part of the money, so I told her I couldn't work with her anymore because I said I couldn't afford to give you all the money because I needed my income, and I didn't want to take all of it. But Christy's done very well for herself since then too. She's a good friend of mine. So anyway, that's about all I know about the stories really. They had those nice Boris Vallejo covers and so forth. They didn't really have much connection to the Hyborian Age, it seemed to me, particularly. The Red Sonja movies, that was really strange. The first movie script I read of Red Sonja, I got interested because my partner and I were forced by our agent to turn it down, because and everything. I'm kind of sorry we were pushed into it later. But one of the earliest versions was written by, to show you how these tortured paths that movies take. The first version I know of was done by, I think it was Roscoe Pallenberg, whose main claim to fame is that he wrote Excalibur, and he'd written it a couple of years before, which is quite a good movie. So it was actually the first sword and sorcery movie in a sense, predating Conan, and used a lot of the Frazetta effects and that kind of thing. In many ways, better than the Conan movie did. And I think it was probably a good screenplay there for Excalibur. The Red Sonja thing, I don't know if it was his idea or somebody else's, but I mean, the characters in it, the characters were named, let's see, there was Ishtar and Wotan and Loki. I mean, and these were people, they were just running around, but they were all named after gods, And the name of the story was Red Sonja, Last of the Amazons. And again, I never blame the writer when I see something on a script, because the writer may write it, but there are producers and directors over there who either approve it or sometimes they tell him, what he has to do. So I'm not trying to blame one person, but it was pretty awful. Later on, as I said, my partner and I were forced to turn it down because what they call the back-end deal, which means the money if the movie becomes a hit or if it gets made, wasn't the same as on the Conan movies, so our agent wouldn't let us do it. So I've never quite forgiven that agent for that. But because I did want to work on it since I had all but created the character. And Doug Munch worked on it, the comic writer, with Ralph Bakshi for a while. He wrote a couple of drafts, and eventually some other people were hauling, including, what's the name that wrote the Flashman novels? Donald Fraser? Yeah, right, wrote it. It turned out kind of a mishmash, and I don't know who's to blame. I think I'd probably blame the director. He was the same director as Conan the Destroyer, and I thought he'd ruined both movies, and so forth. Richard Fleischer, who had directed some fine films years earlier, The Viking, I think, is one of the main reasons he was hired for Conan. That was a good movie. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is a good movie. And Tora, he directed the American segments of that. And a number of other movies that I really liked. And we didn't work with him very much because one of the first things he did when he came on the movie was to kick us off, And we were already working on the 5th draft. I mean, they used all of our material as plots, but then they brought in Stanley Mann, who had written The Mouse That Roared and 4 billion other movies, and they sort of cobbled together. And we had to really go to the Writers Guild board for arbitration to get any credit. They wanted to sort of pretend that even though they had all these plot elements that were all ours, I mean, and so forth, the whole what the quest was and the 2 or 3 stops on it and the characters Zula, and even the casting, if they wanted to look at it that way, all this stuff, somehow or other, it's like we hadn't existed, because, and so there was a big fight, The Hollywood system is, that with writers, is that it pushes them into competing with each other in the worst way, because if you start writing a movie, in order to make sure you get the full credit on a movie, a screenwriter, it has to be shown later that you did, like, I forget the percentage now, but like 75 or 100%. It can't just be that you retyped it and changed a few words, or even changed all the words, but they say the same thing, basically. You have to show that you really, rewrote the thing from the ground up. Now, that means that if a person is put on a movie, and he's told, well, this needs a little bit of work, the first thing he does is to try to show that, no, it doesn't need a little bit of work, it needs to be totally redone. And so the only thing is, in this case, they claimed they totally redid it, but they actually used most of our material. The dialogue was all new, some of it was better, some of it was worse. And there were 1 or 2 really nice scenes that Mann and Fleischer added. The scene that, if you've seen the movie, in which Zula is introduced with one leg tied and fighting all those people, that's purely theirs. I give them full credit for it. It was really great. I don't remember what we did in our various versions, but that was wonderful. And they'd added on this thing at the beginning, which where Conan and his buddies are captured and so forth. But almost every other scene in the movie was something that was taken from our version and not necessarily one of the very best of the 5 versions. In fact, during the next couple of years, we got 2 or 3 more assignments just on the basis of our Conan screenplay, but we never showed anyone the last 4. We only showed them the first one because we hated all the other 4 we did. And but anyway, it's a very tangled road to making a movie, and if it didn't pay well, no one would ever write more than one of them, I'm convinced. On the other hand, you know, I'm now involved with Stan Lee and Stuart Gordon, who did Reanimator, and maybe doing an Iron Man movie, so, you know, just goes to show you, I'll sell out too, you know, and everything. Besides, I like working with Stan, and I haven't worked with him in quite a few years, so it was kind of nice. Yes?
You mentioned a while ago when you were in Hollywood looking for writing some scripts, you mentioned an X-Men script.
Yeah.
What has come of that?
Well, there have been a number of X-Men scripts, and I think there's something in the works again now that has no connection to it. This is about 1983, 84, and we were just approached to write one. We wrote one that was supposed to be sort of more of a James Bond feel. I mean, it wasn't really, I meant in terms of what the menace would be, but of the early figures, the Thunderball kind of thing, not the last couple of years with just drug dealers and things. And we wrote a picture that basically used most of the X-Men that were then the X-Men, as if they were the first X-Men. We did add a new character, a girl from Japan, and so forth, and we had Kitty Pryde, you know, as a not X-Men, but like on the periphery, because that was about the time when she was just becoming an X-Man. And it was kind of a nice story. Our favorite scene was when the villain eventually at the end falls out the nose of one of the idols on Easter Island, you know, and so forth, which sounds pretty gross, but that was our ending. The rest of it was, but it was a big picture. It opened with a tidal wave that destroys part of Hawaii, and it worked up to this nose thing, you know. And in between, it was a lot of fun. It had evil mutants and so forth, and as a matter of fact, Jim Shooter, certainly no fan of mine or Jerry's at the time, and Jim Galton, whom I'd also insulted, who's the publisher of Marvel, both said that it was, word got back to us that it was the best adaptation they had seen of the Marvel characters to that date, but nothing came of it. It was going to be done by Orion Pictures. It was sort of informally involved. The guy would come by a few times. They had, I guess, their own idea of whatever X-Men was. Maybe they wanted something more realistic or something. Remember, this is before Batman, too, and so it just sort of, it's sitting on a shelf somewhere, you know. Oh, it was Wolverine, and it was as if there hadn't been the first group. It was like, you know, Wolverine and Nightcrawler and let's see, who else? Yeah, Scott, of course. Cyclops was there. And I said we made up this Japanese girl. I didn't remember what her power was right offhand. But you know, it was basically, and then a Kitty Pryde, you know, who sort of like hung around and eventually became one by the end, and so forth. And she was in many ways. We had to show you how long ago it was. We thought the part could just about be played by Molly Ringwald at the age of 12 or 13. She was a little too old, wasn't too bad. Now, of course, it's about a decade too late for that.
Who did you have in mind for any of these parts?
Oh no, Molly Ringwald is probably the only. Oh no, there was one more. We wanted to. What was the guy's Ed? I can't remember his name. We wanted to shave his head and make him Professor X. He was in there, but I can't remember his. Ed's. I can't remember his name. Anyway, but we had but we really didn't worry much about casting because we never really got that far. As I said, even the thing with Zula and Conan movie just happened to be they were casting a movie long before they had a final script, and we happened to mention that we had modeled the part physically in our mind was Grace Jones from, really, in my case, more just from the 1 or 2 photographs I'd seen of her, and if she could actually be great for it. And it happened that instead of talking to the producer or director, we were talking to a casting person. And she remembered it, so eventually, although it had to go through a lot of other people, eventually she got the part. But she doesn't, you know, we've never met, she has no idea that role and then the James Bond stuff that followed came because of my partner, basically, Jerry Conway, mentioning that Grace Jones should play Zula. You know, I mean, you know, you just never know how these things go. They just sort of trickle down, more or less.